like to welcome everybody to the Trinity Prep Author Fest. Today's panel is Telling It Like It Is, and I have with us Nancy Castaldo, who is the author of a nonfiction book, When the World Runs Dry, and she's also written several YA middle grade and picture books. And then I also have Kay Ibura, who is the author of the middle grade debut, When the World Turned Upside Down. And she's also an author of adult books and a painter. So I have two like wildly creative women here. And I have lots of questions for y'all about your books. So you've both written books about real world issues. Could you give us a short blurb about each of the books and why they were important for you to write?
Should I go first?
Sure.
Okay. So my book is called When the World Turned Upside Down, which is about when all of our worlds turned upside down. It's the beginning of the pandemic. And it's four friends living in an apartment building, sort of dealing with their issues on their own and the issues that have come into their homes as a result of the pandemic, but then them learning to sort of expand their circle and realize other people are struggling and what they could do to build a stronger community and also to address issues of social justice just by working together. And I think it was important to me just because I am fascinated with the pandemic because I think kids are dealing with everything that adults are dealing with, but we're not able to modulate it for them. There's a lot of crises where we try to figure out how we will handle it with the kids, but they're right on the front lines with us. And I just really wanted to dig into like, what is that experience like for kids? And how can they be empowered as they move through this crary situation?
That's awesome. All right, Nancy.
And my book follows some of those themes and looking at what we're dealing with in our world today and how my readers can navigate that in a safe place. So When the World Runs Dry deals with water issues throughout the world. And it took me to places from Flint, Michigan to Venice, Italy. And I talk about all these different communities and how they're resilient and how people are raising their voices and how we can become more aware of what's going on, but also raise our voices to action and become advocates around the world and our communities, starting with our communities.
Mm-hmm. So y'all both have mentioned community. So that's really interesting that there's kind of that theme in common. So what do y'all hope that readers will take away from your stories, from the books that you've written?
You want me to go first this time?
Your turn.
I'll start in. Well, I hope that my readers, they probably have come to look at my book. They probably have heard about water stories all over the news at some point. There's all kinds of news every day. It seems that there's some type of news. So they're probably coming at it, but they probably don't know the full story of all of these different issues that are impacting us. So I'm hoping that they gain an understanding of what's happening around the world. And then I hope that inspires them to move into the realm of action, that they become empowered, as you were saying, and become active citizens that participate in what's going on. And that will give them, I hope, the hope that we all need right now, because we certainly need hope.
Well, that was one thing that I thought was interesting in looking at both of your books. I feel like hope is definitely a theme that runs throughout. Mm-hmm. And the idea of youth being empowered, especially to have a voice. So I just wanted to interject that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that ties well with what I was going to say, which is that there's this interesting interplay between community and individual, and especially for children, identifying themselves, who they are. A lot of that happens in their social relationships, separating in the middle grade age, they're separating from their family relationships, not completely, but they're defined one way at home. They're seeing these different definitions of themselves in school. So I think that the book sort of has this interplay between who the kids are as individuals and who they are in this relationship. And it gives them, in this friendship between the four of them, and it gives them information about like, okay, who am I in community? How am I being? And so that community feedback, I think, is a really important piece for kids, but it's also really well reflected in the book. And I want kids to really kind of come away from it with, I really, just like social justice kind of, came in really strong after we had been in the pandemic for a few months, it comes into the book at the same time. And I think the kids spent some time kind of finding their unique voices. And I think that's something that I would want kids to feel like they can be themselves and they can be a contribution just by being themselves. They don't have to change who they are. They don't have to be something that they've seen, but they can use their own unique talents, their own unique interests to be who they want to be in the world and support community that way. So that's what I'm hoping that they get from the book.
Nice. Well, and what I've noticed is too, both of your books deal with adversity. Why is it so important in not only in your books, but in life to be able to overcome and deal with adversity?
Well, we all have to. That's part of the qualifications of being a human being. And I don't know how many years ago it was where that word grit came into educational conversations where, they were sort of rating the ability of kids to stick to it, and face challenging things. They're going to learn or be faced with challenges just from the first moment of going to school, with everything they're learning, from building new relationships. It's just a theme of being human. So the more equipped kids are to come against adverse situations and come up with solutions and come up with sort of different approaches, the stronger, more flexible they're going to be. So it's definitely something that I'm interested in. Is kids are dealing with adversity all the time. Sometimes we pretend that they're not, or we pretend that we can protect them from it, and we can't. And that's something we learned in this pandemic. So just the ability to help kids, and teachers do this all the time in the classroom, always like refocusing them. One of my favorite things I ever heard was in the kindergarten classroom. I was walking down the hall and I heard the kindergarten teacher saying, I need you to be problem solvers, so that teachers are constantly like helping children look at, who are you being right now? How can you deal with this situation in a more empowered way? That's the journey of life. So the sooner we can get kids started, the better it'll be for them down the road.
Right.
I totally agree. What happens if we don't? I mean, that's a scary aspect, right? I mean, like you were saying, we all have to, unfortunately, have adversity in our life that makes us human. I think that in writing these books, that we give our readers a safe place to experience those things or explore those types of adversity. And I think that in itself is empowering, because then when they reach a point in their own lives, they've had like a little practice almost of going through some of these things. I hope they don't, I mean, when I doing my water research, different crises were impacting different communities. I don't want to see my readers have this happen to them, but if they do, I want to give them the tools that will help them recognize how others have worked through these difficult situations. And I think books do that in a wonderful way for our readers.
I totally agree. I'm not as avid a reader as I used to be, but when I was constantly having conversations with the characters and learning from them. And you were saying that it's almost like kids can encounter it beforehand in a book. I feel like I relate to characters and plots in that way too, where they're like, oh, okay, this taught me something about life,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, as a teacher, I always have been a proponent that books are safe places for kids to experience things that they may or may not ever experience in life, but hopefully it will, teach empathy and grow their understanding of the world, for sure. So
Exactly.
Nancy, you alluded to research. What kind of research did each of you have to do in order to prepare for your books? Because they both have some element of science that has come into play a little bit or a lot.
Yeah, mine was pretty heavy in that regard, but it was also speaking with the folks that were experiencing these issues, and that's one of my favorite parts of book writing is the research. I am a total research junkie, and I love that aspect. I love diving into the research. It's sort of almost the what happens you have to finally when you have to finally write the book, you know, you have to leave that somewhat behind. But the research for this one was a little tougher than research in most of my other books because it involved going to these communities that had such hardship, and dealing with folks that were experiencing injustice and just hard making it through the day kind of lives. And there were times that I sat at my computer quite upset, even coming back home and trying to write those stories because I wanted to write them and give those folks a voice.
Mhm.
And that was my main focus when I was writing was to listen to these people and be able to tell their stories in a genuine way, an authentic way. It took the book took me, as I said, to many communities, many places, but also the folks that were doing the water protection
Mhm.
and the water warriors and the scientists that were working on the front lines and the folks in law and legislation. So, you know, it was kind of both sides of the coin. So it was fascinating research for this one.
That.
I think for me, the research fell into two areas. One of them was for characters, different components of the characters needing to research their backgrounds. I have a character, Liam, who has anxiety. So researching how chronic anxiety shows up in kids, what are some of the strategies for dealing with it, those kinds of things. Researching one of my characters, she's Indonesian. And so looking at, you know, foods and cultural backgrounds and what would her home life be like and how would that be different from some of the other characters. So I researched those kinds of things, but I also researched, I was nervous about dealing with social justice for, you know, this age group or dealing with it at all. Like I'm very much like, you know, let somebody else do that part. You know, I'll just use my imagination. I'm a fiction writer, you know. And I literally had started writing the book before George Floyd was murdered, and I had already turned in the outline, and I had already turned in the sample pages, and he was murdered. And you know, just a few days later, I was just like, oh my God, this has to go in the book. You know, so it's almost like life kind of was like, okay, come along. This is time for you to have this conversation. And so in doing that, I definitely did some research around what are some children's books dealing with some of these issues. And there's a picture book called Not My Idea. The last name is Higginbotham. I don't remember her first name. And it was all about like a white kid sort of observing things, but the parent trying to like shelter them and be like, it's okay, life's okay, everything's okay. But the kids observing these things, that's bringing anxiety and stress. And so it's about how do you have these authentic conversations with kids, because kids are not passive. They're not passively experiencing life. They're seeing things, they're drawing conclusions. And then there's a dissonance between, you know, what they're seeing and what they're hearing. So that was a great book, and it was a picture book, and it was really great. And this book is anti-racist, which is for young people as well, which is a little bit longer and for a little bit older kids, but it deals with identity, which I think is the in the center of like any justice issues, really just who we are as people and, you know, who we're going to be as a community of people that, you know, have to share resources on this planet. So I did research around sort of how are people talking to kids about social justice, as well as I read some essays from fifth graders about what social justice means to them, because I didn't want to put my own opinions about, you know, how a kid would integrate and think about social justice. So it was great to hear from them, like, what do they think of when they think of social justice and what's fair and what isn't, you know? So I really tried to integrate those things into the book.
So you both write other books. You've written other books other than the two that we're talking about today. How hard was it to make that transition, like from writing an adult book to writing middle grade, or from writing picture books to writing, this nonfiction piece. What is that? How is that transition for y'all?
My turn. Okay.
You want to start?
For me, it wasn't so hard. I like to tell this story that maybe 10, 15 years ago, I had written a story that was in an anthology from a young person's perspective. An editor got in touch with me. Do you write for young people? No, I said. No, I do not write for young people. We make up these stories about who we are and what we do, and that is just our little box that we live in. And I think having been writing for so long and getting, older, as an older person, I'm just like, what is this? Like, why don't I just write, and if an opportunity arises or if I have an idea, why not just go with it? So it really symbolized a bunch of freedom for me to just, go ahead and do this thing that I never imagined myself doing. And it being in the current moment, I think there was an ease for me, just sort of like dealing with something that I'm talking about all the time, so it was actually a little bit of a gift to myself. I really enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I don't know if this, I'm going to speak for you when I say this, but I think every story tells us the way it wants to be written. And I think that when I sit down to write a story, I usually, for the most part, I'm working in nonfiction, and I'll come up with a story idea, a topic that I want to explore, or I feel that my readers can develop critical thinking skills or whatever around. And then that topic generally dictates the form it takes. So for example, if I'm writing about, when I wrote the book about water, I had previously written a book about food insecurity. And that book was also a young adult book called The Story of Seeds. Since then, I've worked on other books about food, and they've been younger. So I've written out a picture book about food, but it ties in because it's still about this bigger topic. It's about sustainable farming, and it's about how we eat and foods across our planet, and our resources and biodiversity. So for me, a lot of these books have this thread that goes through them all, and they just take different forms in age group and in text. But they all, if you look at my bookshelf, and I always say my bookshelf, the books that I've written that are in our mind's bookshelf of all my titles, there's certain threads that go through them, and you'll see that, biodiversity, the planet, resources, things like that. And I think that's basically how I come up with it.
Yeah, you're making me think that I do think sort of under the surface, every writer has like this sort of meta thing that they're communicating, whether it's protecting the planet or, we empowering voices. And I think it comes through. And that's something that I discovered in writing the middle grade, that, the writer's voice is the writer's voice. And it is, Nancy is saying that it changes based on sort of the format, but the core of that voice remains the same. And that's something empowering for me to realize, and to not feel like I have to write in a certain box for me to be authentically communicating as a writer.
And that's a great point. We do tend to get pigeonholed in these boxes, and why? Mm-hmm. Boxes are made to be broken, come out of the box. Yeah. And certainly if we're writers, our creativity flows all over the place. And, it's just a matter of what form it's going to take on a certain day, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of creativity, what does a normal writing day, work day look like for y'all?
Or is there a normal writing day?
No. I'm glad you said that, because I don't have one.
I know, right? I think that's the gift of being a writer, is that we don't have a normal 9-to-5 job. There is no, boilerplate of a day, I think, that we have. I mean, I think that I'm going to speak for us in a collective here, but I mean, we all find the need to write at certain times. But for me, and depending on what book I'm writing, but I'm usually working on more than one book at a time. And they usually take the form of, they're at different stages. And sometimes I'll be researching a book and it'll start taking me down a very, little pathway, like a scavenger hunt. And I'll be like, ooh, that's cool. I want to explore that a little bit more. That may be the seed for another book. So I have to kind of explore that for a little while and then come back to my book. So I at least, put it saved under like a paperweight, so to speak. But for me, there's days that I'm out with scientists. I travel a lot for my books. I also do a lot of the photography for my books. For this particular book, it's all of my photos are in the book, and for my other books as well. So I'm out and about for a lot of my books in the field with scientists or whatever the topic is in my camera. And then there's the times that I'm sitting at my desk and doing those interviews on the phone or online or by Zoom. And obviously our days are different nowadays in the pandemic than they were in 2019 when I was still working on this book. That particular year, I visited 10 national parks.
Wow.
And I think I was absolutely around the entire country. I went out of the country. I went to Cuba. I was in Florida and California and Michigan. And it just, it just stopped dead in its tracks, right? In 2020. So it's been interesting working from home for the most part now for my research and finding topics a little closer to home. And working on books that I've almost put aside because I didn't have the time to do that before. So it's a fun because we have the ability to do that. We can shift our writing schedules and our work schedules and the places that we do that. I do have an office in my home, so my work is done primarily here, but that doesn't mean I don't take my computer to a coffee shop or take my computer to a park, as well.
I love hearing that because I'm not there yet. I do have a 9 to 5. So it's great to hear like, ooh, a writer in the wild. What's her life like? That's going to be me in the future. I love hearing that, you're working on multiple books at once. Cause of course my agent's like, and I'm like, one thing at a time. So thank you for that inspiration.
I look forward to seeing you in the wild.
Thank you. But for me, I write in the morning. I have these alarms set. So I write in the morning. When I'm on it, I'll, really get a few hours in before work. And when I'm not so on it, I'm like getting an hour in. I have to build procrastination time in because I realized, somewhere I saw a quote that there's no such thing as procrastination. And half the time I really am processing in my mind while I'm procrastinating. But the other half of the time I'm just being in fear. I'm just like, oh, I got to write this chapter. Oh, I don't know, and I'm just kind of playing games or reading things and not really working. So all that to say, if I went straight to work, I probably would be faster. But I have times where, I'm drafting, which in a way is easier because you could be sloppier, and so I'll take more time. I have times where I'm editing, where I might spend less time overall, but I'm covering sort of larger distance because I'm not creating the new work. And then I have times where I'm just in beast mode and I'm just pulling it out. And other times where I'm like, I'm just limping around. So what Nancy said about there not being like a classic day is so true because we're human beings. We're not machines. So we have different levels of energy and, we're vibing with the story a little bit differently on one day than another. So there's really a lot of patience and like coaching. You're like cheerleading yourself along the way.
And fortunately we have, I'm assuming you do too, we have these writer buds that do serve as those cheerleaders and that support group and that help us along that path. And
Absolutely.
there's always the times where you're on deadline and it's full stop. And then there's those, like you're saying, procrastination times, those little laggy days. And I look at it as everything is good because it does, you need to have the quiet times too to get the mind moving. And my thing in the summer is swimming. And I take my computer out. I have a pool. I take my computer outside, and that's like my office for the summer. And I was a swimmer, so I that's like my thing. And I just swim, and I just go through plots in my heads, and that's, I feel like it's all working when I'm swimming. You know, it's just like, because our minds just do that. You know, we don't have to be sitting at the computer to be actually writing and working on our stories and our books and in our brains. They just do that.
True. Yeah.
That's true. So what are y'all currently working on? What's next?
I'm working on a YA novel
Ooh.
about a girl with some mysterious powers that she doesn't completely understand. Her grandmother's raising her, and when her grandmother gets sick, she's kind of thrust into the everyday world of like teenagers and things that she, you know, was sheltered from all of her life. And at the same time, certain mysterious happenings start happening, and she needs to figure out who she is, you know, how she's going to respond to these things, and, you know, how to stay safe. So it's a return to speculative fiction for me.
Ooh, now, does this have a title yet?
The working title is Tempest.
Okay.
That sounds
On the
wonderful.
lookout.
I'm excited. I'm excited.
That's fun. I'm working on a few things. I have a book coming out in the summer called The Wolves and Moose of Isle Royale, which takes place in one of those national parks that I visited up in Michigan on Lake Superior. And it's about the oldest predator-prey study on the planet between wolves and moose. And it's my second time working with wolves as my subject. That was fun. So that comes out in the summer. And then I have a book coming out in the fall that I'm still in the writing phase and editing phase, which is called Buildings That Breathe. And that book talks all about urban greening projects around the world. And I'm hoping that changes our landscape a bit.
That's awesome. Well, ladies,
Literally.
Thank you so much for sharing your time and talents with us here at the Trinity Prep Author Fest. I am so appreciative of y'all, and I'm super excited to read what you've got coming out soon. And I hope that y'all will come back and join us maybe when we're in person.
Oh,
when
yeah,
we're back
absolutely.
on campus. You want to come to Florida? Come on.
Yeah. I love all the y'alls. I'm from New Orleans, so it just makes me feel at home when I hear it. I'm like, yes.
Well, and I grew up in Shreveport in Louisiana.
Okay.
So,
That's wonderful.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'd be there too. That was
Awesome.
one of my last in 2019 was a book festival in Florida.
Nice. Well, I will welcome y'all with open arms when we are back in person, hopefully next year. Of course, I thought
Keep
we
our
would be
fingers
back in
crossed.
person this year, but alas, not yet. Not yet. Well, thank y'all so much for being with us. I really appreciate y'all. And I look forward to
Thanks for hosting us.
Oh, you're
Yes,
so welcome.
thanks so much.
Y'all have a great day. Thank you.
You
Take care.
too. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.